Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, William Burton and Barry Loveland, authors of Out in Central Pennsylvania.
Our guests today are William Burton and Barry Loveland, and they are the authors of this book, Out in Central Pennsylvania, The History of an LGBTQ Community. William Burton, we'll start with you. How did this book come about?
Well, it came about quite by accident in a way. I moved to Philadelphia in 2015, and I had just finished my master's degree at UMass Boston. And when I got to Philadelphia, I kind of wanted to use my master's, and as I'd written my master's thesis on gay history, and I wanted to continue doing it. And so I looked around at organizations that were doing something regarding gay history, and I came upon the LGBT History Project in Central Pennsylvania. And I saw that Barry was the director and founder of it. So I contacted Barry, and I went up to Harrisburg and met with Barry to find out what he was doing. He was collecting these oral histories and documenting, gay lives and gay people in Central Pennsylvania. And Barry handed me a stack of about 50 of these oral histories that he had collected. And I took them home and I read them. And frankly, I was mesmerized and I was shocked. And I just couldn't believe the stories that I was reading, these stories about discrimination, harassment, how some of these networks and organizations were formed. And I realized that, my entire life I'd been living in a bubble, that I lived in cities like Houston and Boston and then now Philadelphia, where I didn't have to deal with some of the things that the people in Central Pennsylvania had been living in. I'd always been living in in large urban cities that had gay neighborhoods, that had organizations built in. I could walk out the door and I was surrounded by other gay people. I could easily find and access gay organizations, there were medical facilities. I just never stopped to think about not having any of those amenities around me, what life would be like. And I said to Barry, this would make a terrific book. I said, but the problem would be finding a publisher. And as serendipity would have it, Barry had written an article about a year prior to that about what he was doing at the History Project. And an editor, Captain Yarner at Penn State, had seen this article. And she had contacted Barry and said, we saw what you were doing. We think it's possible to be great material for a book. And would you or anybody on your staff be willing to work with us to develop a book? Well, hello, I raised my hand immediately. I'd be willing to do that. And so that's how the whole thing came about. And so I then spent like the next 9 months working with Penn State developing the book proposal, which then led to a contract. And that's kind of how the whole thing came about.
Barry, how long have you been involved in gathering this information?
Well, we started the History Project in 2012, so it's been about 8 years. And we've been working on gathering oral history interviews with people, about 150 to date. And we've also collected a lot of archival material as well from people who had things in their closets and their attics and basements and things like that. They volunteered to donate to the project. And it's a host of material from historical photos to personal papers to newsletters, organizations, and T-shirts and all sorts of artifacts as well. So it's about 100 linear feet of material that we've collected to date, and we've been working with the Dickinson College archives, and they serve as the repository for the whole collection.
And you say Central Pennsylvania. What's the footprint? What area of the state did you look at?
Yeah, well, initially, we thought we would look at sort of the LGBT center in Central Pennsylvania has sort of a service area of several counties of South Central PA. So we thought we would kind of restrict our efforts to that, but then we realized that a lot of these stories interrelated with what was going on in other parts of the state that were more of the rural parts of the Commonwealth. And so we began expanding that territory a bit, and we've collected material from the north central part of the state. We even have some up in the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area, and over into Allentown and Bethlehem area. So it really has grown in scope in a way, although the book concentrates mostly on the south central part of the state, because that's the largest part of our collection. Has a lot of material from that part of the state. But
did you find that the stories differed much from someone who lived in Harrisburg or Lancaster or York versus someone who lived in, say, the very rural parts of the state?
Well, not a lot, actually. It's quite striking that a lot of similarities between the small cities and towns in Pennsylvania in terms of the stories that we got on people's discrimination that they faced, the difficulties coming out, the difficulties in trying to achieve local protections through local ordinances. A lot of these stories were similar and resonated.
Did the way governments treated the issue vary much from the small cities like Harrisburg, Lancaster, York versus the rural areas?
Well, I think the interesting part was when you started when we looked at the anti-discrimination, as they pursued the anti-discrimination ordinances, whether it be Harrisburg, Lancaster, York, what was very similar were the arguments against the passage of these ordinances, and the arguments were all very similar. They all were religious, that they were going to condone this immoral behavior, and that they were all walking into Satan's hands. And those arguments really didn't vary from city to city, and it was really kind of so the arguments you heard all across the nation, whether it be in Colorado when they were fighting that amendment, and those big battles that were taking place, or the Anita Bryant crusade. So that was what all gay people were facing on their fight for civil rights. That all the LGBT community had to hone their arguments against the religious right. So that was kind of the same drumbeat that was heard in non-urban areas as it was heard in large urban areas.
Well, Bill, when you had all these oral histories to work with, how did you turn that into a narrative?
Well, so that was the challenge when we first started doing the book proposal, and I was thinking, how do I write this? Do I write it in chapters of, okay, we'll do a chapter on discrimination, we'll do a chapter on harassment, and Catherine at Penn State said, why don't you do it by decades? And that's when it really all fell into place. So we started kind of in the 1960s and then moved forward. And that's when I sat down with Barry and said, okay, let's look at the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what are the stories that we need to tell? And then it all really fell into place perfectly. Because when you looked at the 70s, what happened then? What organizations formed? Who were the key people? Who were the key players? What stories have to be told? And suddenly it was like easy to pull out what needed to be told. And it was amazing how it all fell into place. And then in most of the chapters, we had a profile section where we highlighted certain individual stories that were kind of appropriate to the chapter. And some of those profiles centered on discrimination, some of them were on harassment, some were uplifting, some were like rather shocking and you could say depressing, but they were appropriate to the chapters as the decades moved on.
Bill, how did you identify the people you wanted to do the oral histories with?
It was dependent upon the story what was going on. Like when we were talking about, the chapter of the fighting, the chapter called Battles, we're talking about Harrisburg, Lancaster, and York. There were certain key players that were instrumental in those battles, so we wanted to talk to them. In the profile section, I profiled a woman, Nancy Pound, who was a key player in the Lancaster battle for their ordinance. And she also at that time opened a bookstore, a gay bookstore in downtown Lancaster on Main Street. And this was in the 90s, when nationwide there was a growing awareness of the gay movement and kind of a growing acceptance, both in the theater and the arts and in politics, Bill Clinton. And so I was living in Boston at the time, and we had 3 gay bookstores at the time. No one gave it a thought. Well, in Lancaster, I think because of Nancy's notoriety and taking the lead and fighting for the ordinance, when she started opening the bookstore, she started getting threats about the bookstore, and eventually it was firebombed. It was firebombed twice. And the threats, she was under such fear that who was going to get hurt? Was she going to get murdered? Was she going to get killed? That she eventually had to close her bookstore. Well, I said to Barry, I want to interview Nancy. So, I interviewed Nancy at her home, and 30 years after the fact of this, her bookstore being firebombed and closing, when she would be telling the story, tears came to her eyes. And, I said I owe an obligation to this woman to tell her story right. Because the pain 30 years later was still very, very real. So there's things like that as we went through and started tracing what had to be told. Certain stories became evident, and certain people came evident. You have to tell their story. You have to talk about this.
Barry, what was going on in the gay movement when you came of age?
Well, I was actually not here when I sort of came of age. I came out when I was in college at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in New York. And it was a time where there were very few organizations and very few resources around. It was 1977 when I came out. But in Albany, New York, which was close to where I was going to school, they had a gay center, gay community center. It was one of the first, one of the earliest in the state, and was one of the places that you could go to not only meet some people, but also find out, where resources were, gay bars, for example, to socialize, and how to navigate sort of the civil rights issues of the time. And so that was kind of my coming out process, going there and also socializing in some of the bars in Albany. But then in 1983, I moved to Pennsylvania after graduate school and another position down south that I took for a few years. But I moved to Harrisburg in 1983. And fortunately, there was quite a bit going on in Harrisburg at that point. In fact, I was wanted to make sure that I was going to be protected in my job before I decided to move, because I was coming from Montgomery, Alabama at that time, and there were absolutely no protections in the state of Alabama for people who were gay or lesbian. So at that point, I checked with the LGBT center, or not the center, the switchboard, gay and lesbian switchboard of Harrisburg was in existence at that point, actually started in 1975. So I called the switchboard up and said I was thinking of moving there for a job, and they told me about all the resources and all the protections available and so forth. They had just passed the local ordinance in Harrisburg, but also years before that, in 1975, Governor Schaap issued an executive order protecting all state employees based on sexual orientation. That was the first such order of any state in the country. So it was important to me to know that before I decided to take the position working for the state of Pennsylvania.
And that's a story we really wanted to, not very sorry, but I mean about Milton Schaap, Governor Milton Schaap, that we really wanted to get out in the book because he's kind of like one of the unsung heroes of the gay and lesbian movement because of his executive order. That was the first anywhere in the country of any anti-discrimination ordinance protecting gays and lesbians anywhere in the country. And nobody knows about it. I didn't know about it. And it happened here in Pennsylvania. And the shocking thing is that Pennsylvania still does not have a statewide ordinance protecting gays and lesbians. And 64% of the state towns and communities in the state are still not protected. Only 34% of the state has protections protecting LGBT people. And those are passed locally. It's kind of amazing that the state has not come to the forefront yet. Maybe they will, but it's still.
You say in your book that it was in 1976 that Governor Schaap declared Gay Pride Week.
That's right. Yeah, he issued a Gay Pride Week executive order, and immediately got a lot of pushback from the state legislature. There was a number of legislators who objected to this idea of celebrating gay pride. They thought that the governor went too far. And so they started proposing some legislation which would restrict gay people from a lot of professions. And so that legislation went through and was passed, and the governor vetoed it. But it was a little bit of a tense position for Governor Schaap to be putting himself out there and supporting gay rights. In 1976, he also created the first LGBT organization that was, or part of state government, that was an official part of state government, called the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. This was the first official governmental body anywhere in the country that was designed to provide improvements to public policy for LGBTQ people. And so his contributions to LGBTQ history and civil rights are pretty amazing. He was way ahead of his time, I think.
Did the Council on Sexual Minorities continue after the Schaap administration? What happened to it?
It did. Yeah, it did. Continued through the Thornburg administration, if you can believe that. Thornburg was a Republican. And so it was pretty amazing that Thornburg decided to reappoint the council and maintain the council through his administration. And they made a lot of very significant contributions to public policy. That was the time of the AIDS crisis. And at that point, Pennsylvania was starting to get hit pretty hard from the number of AIDS cases. And the council helped put into place a lot of important public policy related to AIDS through training and drug distribution for AZT and all sorts of programs that became the model for a lot of other states. So it was a pretty important period of time for the council.
Does it still exist?
Yeah, because it kind of took a little bit of dip after CAP, and then when the AIDS crisis hit, it kind of, the council took on a lot more importance because of the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, the council ceased to exist after Thornburg. Governor Casey, when he came in, he did not reappoint the council. However, the current governor has actually appointed a similar council, a little bit different title and a little bit different focus, but it certainly has made a come full circle and brought back some of the important function of advising state government.
Bill, a lot of your chapters start with a reference to a Stonewall event. For people who don't know, can you refresh our memories on what Stonewall was?
Well, Stonewall is actually it's the galvanizing force in the gay community. There certainly were, there was a protest that happened in New York City when the police raided the Stonewall bar. And at that point, the gay community had enough and resisted and fought back. And the 3 or 4 preceding nights after that, there were like 2,000 or 3,000 people in Sheridan Square protesting and fighting the police against the harassment against the gay community. But and that riot took on national significance. Certainly before Stonewall, there were outbursts against police harassment and crackdowns against the gay community. We documented what happened in the 60s in Harrisburg when the police were trying to crack down around the State Street area, arresting men for cruising around the State Street area and arresting them. When they would arrest them, their names would appear in the paper. They were fined and given terms in jail. The devastating things, their names and addresses were published in the local paper. But there were different instances in LA. I had it in the book, LA, Philadelphia, Chicago, where where the gays and lesbians fought back against the police. But there was none of these prior riots or whatever, protests against police actually galvanized the entire gay and lesbian community, nationwide. But when Stonewall happened, it just took fire. I mean, it just took fire nationwide, and it just galvanized the entire gay community, and like, enough is enough. And out of that sprung a couple gay activist alliances, the Gay Activist Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front, to fight for anti-discrimination ordinances and gay civil rights. And so that was kind of the beginning of the gay liberation movement. And so you begin to see across the country, mainly in large cities, this fight for gay rights to take hold. That eventually made its way into central Pennsylvania. And we started documenting, the book documents some of these small little groups that would form to stay informed about how can we fight, to get our rights. Well, the first step is coming out, which is a very hard thing to do. to say that you're gay or lesbian and let people know about it. And some of these groups were, fighting for that, but also the offshoot of that was they also became social outlets where other gay people could meet other gay people and expand their communities, and expand their networks. And that was one of the key components of how the gay community formed in central Pennsylvania.
Was there a defining moment in Pennsylvania, like Stonewall, some Pennsylvania equivalent of it?
No, I think that was the point we wanted to document in why this book was important, is because, like, when you think about gay communities, the natural inclination is to think about large urban areas like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco. You don't think about a gay community in a non-urban area. And so what I found intriguing, because I was one of those that fled to a large urban area as a young man, was how does a gay community form in a non-urban area where there are no gay neighborhoods, there are no laws to protect you, there's no social organization. So to me, it was fascinating to see how this gay community formed and developed its social network and formed their community and formed these ties that bind and built their community without these other support systems, especially in a conservative area. Because in these large urban areas, generally the community around it is generally progressive and would allow the gay community to kind of survive. That's not to say everybody in a large urban area is liberal and progressive, because we know that's the case. But it allows the gay community to survive and go kind of unmolested for the most part. So that's why we wanted to write this book, to make sure that defines how a gay community can form and develop in a non-urban area. Now, there are books that have been written about rural areas, but the books that have been written, if you look at them, they basically talk about race, class, religion, or they're just strictly coming out stories. They're not really centered around how the community in a rural area develops in the community itself. And out in central Pennsylvania is about the community and how it developed.
Bill,
if I could add,
yeah,
if I could just add to that a little bit, it was interesting that Governor Shapp, in a way, pulled together the community in central Pennsylvania, because a lot of people were attending his task force meetings leading up to forming the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, and a lot of the people from the rural areas had never met each other, and it was really an opportunity for them to get together at these meetings, and they would start caucusing then after the formal meetings, and start informally talking about ways that they could work together. And so a lot of the representatives from these various small groups from around various cities and towns in Pennsylvania formed a group called the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. And the caucus was a way for all of these small groups to come together and work on projects that were too big for any one of them to take on themselves. So things like the first Gay Education Day, which was a lobbying effort for state government. They put that together in 1976 to lobby the legislature for civil rights protections. That was the first time that had been done in the state. They also organized the first gay conference in the state, and they held a series of gay conferences every year for several years as a way to educate the community about various issues involving LGBT rights and protections and other issues, and as a way to also pull the community together to start helping each other work through all these different issues. So that was a pretty amazing story as well in the book.
Well, let me ask you both the same question. Why should a straight person read this book?
Well, it's about the development of human rights and how a community developed. It's American history. It's American study. It's like if you went to university and you're going to major in American studies, you want to know about different communities and how different things develop. And that's why that could be one of the books to read if you were in American studies. So it's like, why be blind to the fact of how anything develops, and also the discrimination that goes on and what's behind it. It's an eye-opener. Why sit around in ignorance when you can see what mankind does to mankind itself, and some of the cruelty that goes on, and some of the faulty reasoning. It's a check on yourself, I think. It's like anything, you want to be informed. It's like, why would anybody want to read a book about the transgender experience? And what one goes through. I did a book review on a book called, Once a Girl, Always a Boy. And it was written from the mother's perspective about her son, who was born a girl, and that transition that her son went through from a girl to a boy. And to me, it was an eye-opener to what the parents go through, to what the child goes through. It's a deep emotional awakening to understand what both parties go through, and increase my understanding of the situation. So I'd recommend that book too. It's like, people need to know, because sometimes we're walking around in ignorance and we don't know what's going on. We don't understand things. And I think it's a reason to understand why we should read and find out what went on, what's going on, and the things that are behind it.
Barry, same question.
Yeah, I would say that today it's hard to find any person who isn't touched in some way by the gay and lesbian, the LGBTQ community. That there's someone that they know, or that is a member of their family, maybe a son or a daughter. I think it's pretty amazing today. People are much more comfortable coming out at an early age. So it's much more likely that any family or any person is going to know or have a person in their family who is LGBTQ. And to know that history, I think, is important, because when a young person comes out today, they have no concept of what it was like, 40, 50, 60 years ago to have come out then, as opposed to today. And they take for granted a lot of protections and gains that have been made for the community. People who come out in a heterosexual family don't have a grandparent to tell stories about the past, about the LGBTQ past. They have stories about their own family, to be sure, but they don't have that history of the community of that person, that's coming into. So I think it's important that straight people have an understanding, because they know people who are LGBTQ.
Bill, I want to ask you something. You referred to the transsexual community, and you say in here, the transgender community, and you say they have sustained much discrimination even from within the LGBTQ community at large. Can you talk a little bit about that, about when the T was added to LGB, and what kind of discrimination they felt within the community?
Yeah, because I think that happened I think during the March on Washington back in around the 2000 time period, because I think they were basically misunderstood. They, as a community, because like they said, they were transsexuals, people on with drag queens, they didn't quite understand it. And so it wasn't until the community itself galvanized and made its movement to be recognized. There's always, of course, the acronym was gay, and it was gay and lesbian and gay, and bisexual was added. And then finally, the recognition of the transgender community and what it was. And I think a lot of it was, I think a lot of gays and lesbians don't really understand what it means to be transgender and not to be comfortable with your own gender identity, that you really are a woman inside and trapped in a man's body, or you are a man inside trapped in a woman's body. And you don't look like looking at yourself. It's just not what you are. And to gain acceptance like that, because like the minute you came out, you can lose your family, your income, the matter of getting your driver's license changed was virtually impossible. And so not only was there discrimination and harassment by the heterosexual community, there was a great misunderstanding within the gay and lesbian community about it, because people just didn't understand it and didn't get it. So I think the transgender community had to go through educating not only their own families in the world, but also the gay and lesbian community about what it really meant to be transgender and to gain acceptance. And I think they have made tremendous inroad on what it is to be that way. It was an eye-opener for me to interview some of these people. I needed an education on it. And, sometimes I was afraid to ask questions. I didn't want to go too deep or to be too personal, but I asked if I could ask, and they said, ask away. And they were very forthcoming. And it's a real education process. And I feel enriched by it now that I have a better understanding of what they've gone through and what gender dysphoria is, and how terrible it can be until you can rectify it.
Barry, can you changing subject a little bit, but Barry, can you talk about the role of women in the LGBTQ community, and were women involved as activists in the beginning, or was it predominantly a male-oriented movement in the beginning?
Sure. There were a lot of important activists from the women's community early on. I can think of Barbara Giddings in Philadelphia, of course, who really was someone who was really important in the movement from the 1960s on. But here in central Pennsylvania, we had our own activists as well. Mary Nan Caro from Harrisburg, who was very active in pushing for the ordinance in Harrisburg in 1983. She became the president of the National Organization for Women's Pennsylvania chapter. She worked very hard in civil rights protections throughout the state through her association with NOW, and also she was a staff person with the State Human Relations Commission. She also worked considerably with the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus, was an important figure in that organization as well. And there were many others too that were active in the caucus, were active in the council that we talked about, and were active in various organizations throughout central PA and eastern PA, north central part of the state. So yeah, very active movement. There was a very active women's music movement. Bobby Carmichael, we talk about in the book as well, who was really one of the founding people in central PA of women's music, and was very important to the lesbian community in central PA. And there was an organization in north central Pennsylvania called the Lesbian Connection up at State College, which was a group of women who would get together and using a phone tree would let each other know about events going on. And then Lorraine Kajawa in Harrisburg started the Lavender Letter, which was a important publication that let women, central PA, lesbian women, know about activities and organizations and events going on. And that newsletter lasted for many, many years, right up until after 2000. It started in 1980s, early 80s.
And was the movement integrated from the beginning? Were African Americans involved in it? And was there any kind of coordination between the civil rights movement and the LGBTQ movement?
I would say that there was integration. In central PA, there weren't, as far as we've been able to tell, separate bars or separate organizations that African Americans or people of color were involved with. They were pretty integrated into the organizations in general. It was a small participation, though. From what we could find, it was not a huge number of people, and we had trouble finding people of color to tell their stories for the LGBT Centers History Project, as well as for the book. But there were a few, and a few very important people were involved. Dr. Eric Selvey, for example, in Harrisburg, is someone who was involved very early in the 80s with organizations, including the drag troupe, Lily White and Company, that went through and did performances throughout central Pennsylvania. And they raised money for AIDS organizations and other LGBTQ organizations. He was on the board of that group. He was also the first gay man who was appointed chair of the Human Relations Commission in the city of Harrisburg. So, and he also organized several of the gay pride celebrations in Harrisburg, and also had a gay publication that he did in the 90s. So there are people of color who had made some important contributions here.
And Bill,
I think there's not been, even on the national level, there's not been much interplay between, the national gay organizations and like the NAACP. What really helped was when the NAACP endorsed the March on Washington back in around the 2000 era too. They endorsed that march. That was the first big endorsement that helped, one of the LGBT movement at the time. So there hasn't been an active working together between the two groups, but they endorse each other back and forth. I think, and support each other. I wouldn't say there's an active involvement, but I think there's a mutual admiration society and a mutual support system going on.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the institutions and how they worked with or against the LGBTQ movement, like the churches. When you deal with churches, where'd you find receptivity and where'd you find opposition?
Again, like when I was researching the ordinances, most of the organizations that thought it were religious organizations, the ones that were supportive, there was basic one like Dignity, the Metropolitan Community Church, Dignity Central, were writing supportive letters. The Catholic, out of Dignity Central, there was a Catholic priest that helped run that. Father, what was his name?
Father Saudi.
Father, yeah, blanking out. He wrote a letter in support of the ordinances. The Catholic Church did not, obviously did not actively support it. So there wasn't really one organized church that was supporting the gay passage of ordinances.
That's been changing over time. Now, the Central Pennsylvania region has a tremendous number of churches that have outreach to the LGBTQ.
Yeah, that's changed over time.
Yeah, that's changed drastically over time. And now if you go to a gay pride event in Central Pennsylvania, you'll see dozens of booths from congregations of various denominations reaching out to the community.
Yeah, that's one thing that we noted, speaking of the gay pride, that Stonewall happened in 1969, and the first gay pride parade was held a year later in New York, and I think Chicago, Los Angeles, and soon, in cities and towns across the country and in Europe, they were holding gay pride parades. Philadelphia, Central Pennsylvania didn't hold their first one until like 14 years later. And they never called it, the word gay never entered into it. It was called an open air festival. They never, because of the fear of backlash, and they didn't want any publicity because of the fear of backlash in Central Pennsylvania. And when they did hold it, it was in the middle of 1984, I think, and the first one was held. At that point in time in the large cities, those gay pride parades were, protesting, about the AIDS, the AIDS problem, fighting for drugs, gays in the military. There were at that point little squeaks about, domestic partnership and gay marriage. They were becoming kind of political at that time. But in Central Pennsylvania, it didn't take on that tone. It took on a tone of coming together and celebration of who we are. And that tone, that same tone in Central Pennsylvania stayed the same all the way through the 80s and through the 90s. And gay pride never, in Central PA, never really became a political football or animal. It was always a celebration of pride and coming together. Well, in the large urban areas, they became political footballs. Soon mayors and governors were walking in these gay pride parades. It kind of stayed more quiet in Central Pennsylvania. Eventually, they did change the name to gay, unless, the word gay did enter into the title. I'm forgetting the year. I've got to go back and look at my book.
1992.
1992. And so, and now there's a little more politics in and into it, in the 21st century, but it's still nothing like the big urban areas.
Barry, I want to ask you, and I guess I should ask both of you, a big part of your book is about the AIDS crisis. And can you talk a little bit about when that first appeared and what effect it had on the gay community?
Well, it happened a couple of, the AIDS thing first kind of happened in 1981, 82, when cases first started showing up. And I think the first AIDS cases in Central PA was in 83, 84, when the first person died. to give you a perspective of it, by 1990, there were 15,000 cases of AIDS in Pennsylvania, and in Central PA there was 1,700. So now the bulk of those cases in Pennsylvania were in Philadelphia, and some in Pittsburgh. But there were cases in Central PA, and when we looked at, I just document the first early years of the AIDS crisis. We didn't go through all of it, just the first, 5 or 6 years of what happened. And the community did respond with the organization called SCAN South, Central AIDS Assistance Network. And they started raising money to help people get, food and housing and care and wheelchairs. We had a hospice that developed in York that Joe Eufema developed that was one of the best hospices anywhere in the nation. People could go and die. There was an organization in New York that developed on the same thing that happened, was very similar to SCAN. The community pulled together like they were doing elsewhere to help these AIDS victims and to take care of them. There was still, discrimination going on. Doctors were afraid to treat people. The first AIDS organizers were, in fact, the ones distributing information to doctors on how to treat it, how to treat the disease, getting education out to schools and teachers and organizations on what the disease is, how to handle it, safe sex. As the information came in, they were turning that right around and trying to get it out in the community and going out handing out condoms and information handbooks. It was a call to arms, just like it was in the big cities, but it was done on a very locally small base, and it was just they had to turn on them and look to themselves and how are we going to deal with it, because there was no help coming from anyone. It's like it was everywhere else in the nation. So the small group of people, and we try to highlight who they were, pull together to save people and get this, to fight the pandemic, the epidemic, and try to help people and save their lives. It was kind of a moving story that they could take people to the hospital for driving miles, whether it was in Williamsport or in Harrisburg, what they had to do to help people and find those people that were isolated and help.
And Barry, what do you remember about that time?
Yeah, it was a really difficult time for our community. People were very scared. They didn't really know too much about the disease at that point. And so, Gary Norton, for example, was a person who was one of the more high-profile members of our community in Central PA. He had been living up in Williamsport. He helped start organizations up there, and he'd moved to Harrisburg before he got sick. And he helped start MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church in Harrisburg, which was a gay congregation, predominantly gay congregation. He worked on a number of other things in the community, and people recognized him and knew him. And when he got sick, it was a scary, eye-opening thing for our community. So a lot of people stepped up at that point and volunteered for SCAN, to start SCAN, as Bill mentioned. Other cities, other small cities around Harrisburg started organizations as well. Again, mostly volunteer, mostly through a buddy system, people teaming up with someone who was sick, providing them with a lot of care. It was an emotional time.
That's why, I think that chapter is important. And I realized that when I went back to school to get my master's, and I was an older student, obviously, and there were some a lot of younger students there. and younger gay students, and I was kind of, I shouldn't have been, but I was amazed at some of these younger gay students, that they didn't live through the AIDS crisis. They had no idea what had gone on. And, I'm sitting there, I had lived through it. I watched my friends die. And it's kind of like, how are you going to get these kids to understand what it was like, other than watching a movie like Philadelphia, or reading a book like this, or, you got to direct them because they have no idea what went on or what it was like. They're living in an age of PrEP where they can take something and AIDS is no longer the threat that it was. So the world's changed, and you need books like this that kind of talk about what it was like.
I'd also like to mention the fact that with the women's community really stepped up at that point too to help out, because so many gay men were passing away or were sick, and that was a time when they really got involved and volunteered to help out.
We only have about a minute left, but Barry, let me ask you the last question. Is the battle won, or is there more to be done?
No, there's definitely more to be done. I think we can see from the current atmosphere and current political situation that we're in that things are always in danger. You never know that our rights are going to be secured and guaranteed. You can't take anything for granted. These things can be taken away just as easily as they were granted. So it's very important that we stay in the fight and in the effort to work towards total equality for all people.
That's going to have to be the last word. We are out of time. We've been speaking with William Burton and Barry Loveland. They are the authors of this book, Out in Central Pennsylvania, The History of an LGBTQ Community. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.